So thank you, Barend, and guten Tag to all of you, and nice seeing some other people I haven't seen in a while, Felix and Clemens. Um, and thank you for this opportunity to spend, well, my morning and your afternoon with you for a few minutes. So I came to this topic some years ago as a very strange aspect of studying Sunzi's art of war and Chinese military thought in general. And I had not actually originally intended to do this study first. I was originally going to do it in about 30 years. I was intending on finishing the study of Chinese military thought by talking about how it has been interpreted in the West. But because, as Barron knows and other sinologists or East Asianists know, you are in a department of people who study Western topics. And I was told as I was coming up for tenure, yeah, we know about all that you can do all that ancient China stuff. Can you do something we can care about? And functionally, that actually meant something really which was mostly about the West rather than China. So this is a topic that I had actually realized was important and significant when I was an undergraduate and did my senior thesis translating Swin's Art of War. Uh, Geez, that was a long time ago, 1989. So this topic is really about how, when we look at a text like Swin's Art of War, and it has been fully, to a great extent, incorporated into Western culture, how we misread it and misunderstand it. And there are many aspects of this, but I'll cover some of them, and you can ask me about some of the others if I miss something that you wanted me to talk about. So, hang on, let me see if I can get this. My thing is not advancing. There we go. So I'm going to first talk about how Swinza becomes attached to this notion in the West of indirect strategy. And then I'm going to talk about how we get this Clausewitz versus Swinza paradigm in the West, which is so widely prevalent. And then I'm going to talk about Swinza in and out of context. And I do want to preface all this by saying, of course, that Swinza, as far as we know, did not exist. There is no Master Swin. There might have been some guy, Master Swin, but mostly it appears to be a mythical figure. Certainly, the biography in the Shurji is nonsense, and it's basically a reflection of someone else. And sorry, the cat is scratching at the door, trying to get in. This is perhaps the thing that gets me in most trouble when I start out and say that, and I get some very angry people saying, "How can you say that didn't exist?" It's right up there with when I tell them that Shaolin is not the source of Chinese martial arts. Boy, you get some very angry people with that. So why basically my point here is going to be about how it is that we in the West see Swinza the way we do, and then some of the significance of that. So let's see, get this guy down here. All right, so the first thing off is that when you start studying Swinza in English or in a European language, you very quickly get into trouble when you go into Chinese language because you can't actually seem to find anybody saying the same things. So when I was in Taiwan a long, long time ago and I said, "Oh, I'm in Taiwan, I'm going to get some Chinese works on Swinza and I will read them and it will talk about indirect strategy." And I literally ran into this problem of trying to explain in Chinese what indirect strategy was to Chinese people as I was talking about Swinza. And they really were just sort of looking at me and they're like, "Okay, your Chinese sucks. And that's why it doesn't make any sense." And so then I would sort of go buy books, and I still actually have a whole bunch of them, and it's not there. So this was very perplexing to me. How is it that there was this reading of Swinza that I was absolutely, convinced this was what's going on, and it shows up. And when I say this shows up in the West, I don't just mean in terms of these ridiculous books like, Swinza and Dating, and there is such a book. Uh, there are things like if I go in and I have occasion to speak to the US military about these sort of matters, and they all are like, "Well, Swinza is indirect strategy." And then you sort of say to them, "What do you mean by that?" And they don't really know what they mean by that. Essentially, it means not Western. but they imagine that there's this Chinese construction of indirect strategy. And so you then go looking for it and you can't really find it. So this was my first hint that something weird was going on. But again, for the longest time, you spend a lot of time thinking it's just my misunderstanding. So let me there. And this is my book on the subject. It's out in paperback now, so it's relatively inexpensive. It's not like one of those Braille books that requires you to have a grant to be able to afford. And we are coming up on Christmas, so I think you should all buy them for yourselves and for all your loved ones. What 5-year-old wouldn't want to receive such a pretty book? I'm trying to, it's my belief that everyone in the US military should have at least one copy, if not two, purely for educational reasons. Now, the cover of this book, by the way, comes from the 1766 French publication of the translation by Father Amio, who's kind of important in all of this, and we'll come back to him. What I have not been able to figure out in all of this is where this formation comes from. There's a whole bunch of formations like this in the publication, and I have not yet been able to track down whether this was an invention of some French publisher or whether this was a set of images that Father Amio sent with the original translation. That this whole translation by Father Amio is very problematic. There's a lot of things I don't quite understand yet. And I gave a paper on this a little while ago at a conference, which I was in danger of having to make into a real paper for the conference volume, but then that fell apart, so I'm off the hook. But it's really how my paper on that was how Swinza became an Enlightenment military thinker. And for those of you in context, and this will come back again, is Clausewitz, of course, is a counter-Enlightenment or German Romantic thinker. That's how at least Azergat fits him into the Western tradition of military thought, of strategic thought. This is all very significant in understanding how Swinza has come to be understood. So this Western reading of Swinza is actually mostly a product of strategic thinking after World War I. Essentially, what we had was, and I'm going to not go into World War I quite so much for you guys because Europeans tend to actually know what happened. Americans are woefully ignorant of World War I. We don't actually offer a class on World War I at Vanderbilt, nor have we ever, I don't think. But one of the central problems of World War I from the strategic point of view was, wow, we got all this modern technology, we got all this new kind of warfare, and as a result of which we ended up with trench warfare. We were stuck. How do we get unstuck? And in the British way of thinking, they would ultimately, and this comes down to B.H. Littleheart, we'll get to him in a second, this was Clausewitz's fault. Now, why this was Clausewitz's fault is much more to do with Littleheart than necessarily actual German strategy. But World War I marks this kind of uh, intellectual breakpoint. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff that comes out of attempts to think through new technologies which come in World War I, although obviously they had precursors before that, and fully develops in World War II and after that. So this is a picture of Little Hart, who was, in his day, he was, at least certainly in his own eyes, the most important strategist in the world. Certainly in British terms, in the 1920s and 30s, and 30s in particular, he's the most prominent British military writer. Whether you want to call him a strategist, that's a sort of personal choice. He was a very odd man in many respects, in that very British way. And in addition to being a military writer, he also wrote on tennis and women's fashion. I, yeah, I'm not even going to go anywhere with that. About that, the less said, the better. The other thing that's very important to keep in mind about Little Heart, and historically, and as historians, it's one of those curious aspects. One of the reasons why Little Heart actually is and will remain so important is he kept all of his correspondence, and he corresponded with a lot of people, and he donated that archive uh, to School of, well, basically in London, his King's College. And if you want to study this time period, his archive is superb. It's absolutely fantastic. And he would keep copies of the letters he would send out and copies of the responses. So you have the great advantage that when you go into his archive, which is very, very professionally done, wonderful archive. I've used it 3 times now and probably go back this summer just to look at some stuff. You can get both sides of a correspondence. A very important man, though. He and his sort of what we'd call in English frenemy, JFC Fuller, were some of the early tank theorists. And of course, Fuller ends up being invited to Hitler's birthday party and is a full-on fascist, which is why Fuller, uh, when World War II breaks out, which is why Fuller, although he was a brigadier general, is not actually employed in World War II. And he's a little bit miffed about that, but he seems not to have been able to understand how being a buddy of Hitler would make the British military a little bit reluctant to employ him. They are trying to figure out how to overcome the static warfare of World War I. And a lot of their personal responses were they were going to use tanks, and tanks are very important. Somehow this is going to break out, and as we see, of course, uh, with what will be in Kesselschlag, but becomes later in English terms where we talk about Blitzkrieg, this kind of ideas about how we're not going to have uh, trench warfare again. But there's a really weird bit that happens in all of this that ends up making Swinza important because Swinza had already been translated. Swinza had been translated to French, as I said, in 1766. It gets reissued in 1782. There is a lot of significance to that translation, which we'll come to. Swinza is translated again by Everard Calthrop, a British officer who translates it in Japan in 1905, and then a revised version 1908. And Lionel Giles, British sinologist, translates it in 1911. None of these earlier translations, none of the English translations have much effect. But this 1963 translation by Samuel Griffith does have a major effect on our understanding of Swinza, and not just Swinza, because as Barron will attest, there is so little information on Chinese military history in the West. What has been substituted is translations of Sunzi. So you'll have people who they don't know anything about a Chinese battle that's ever taken place. So what they do is they say, okay, and here's this one work. And Swinzi has the advantage of being very short. So you can read the Swinzi, say, this is what Chinese strategy is about. And now I compare that one book with that one reading to all of Western military history. We have nothing equivalent to Hans Delbrück's, major contribution, even whether you like it or not. We know all these Western battles. There is almost nothing on Chinese battle history. And there are huge problems with this across the board. So what happens is we get this very strange event, which is that Samuel Griffith, a U.S. Marine, he musters out. He's actually fights. He's what we call in English a China Marine. He serves in China. He is then involved in World War II in the Pacific. He is a Marine raider. He goes off. He fights on Guadalcanal. He goes back to China after World War II. That part of his life I have not found any information on. I'm sure it's somewhere. He's doing something. He's in Europe after World War II. And in an interview he did later, whatever he did in Europe after World War II was classified. Not sure where you find out what happens. Anyway, he retires from the Marine Corps. He's promoted in retirement to brigadier general, and then he does the interesting thing. He goes to Oxford and he does a DPhil, and his dissertation, his thesis, is a translation of Swinzi's Art of War. When he gets to England, he meets Little Heart and actually become he and his wife become very good friends with Little Heart and his wife. And so as he's writing his dissertation, he's sending chapters to Little Heart. Little Heart's actually writing, comments in there, and their correspondences forms a lot of the central part of this book I just did. And it's a very interesting correspondence because you actually see the progress of a dissertation and you see the influence of Little Heart. Most importantly, though, for our purposes here, is because of that friendship and because Little Heart was perceived as being such a famous and important strategist, he writes a foreword to the publication of Griffith's translation. And in that foreword, he says, Swinza had this indirect strategy just as I have proposed. So it is actually Little Heart strategy is indirect strategy, not Swinza, but he attaches Swinza strategy to his indirect strategy, and that becomes linked. At the same time, Griffith makes this comment that Mao Zedong uh, was a disciple of Swinza, and therefore we now have this connection between indirect strategy, Swinza and Mao Zedong. Let's see this. There we go. So there's Griffith on one side. There's I think that's actually my copy of the Swinza translation and Mao Zedong. So we have this equation that because Mao did guerrilla warfare, that this must be indirect warfare, indirect strategy, and it's through Swinza and Griffith. So this is a complete muddle. Griffith has no reason for connecting Mao's thought with indirect warfare or Swinza. And in fact, there's very good evidence that Mao had actually not read Swinza until much, much later in his career, considerably after he wrote his own strategic works. This is a very big muddle. It's not as much of a problem in Chinese because they've never had this connection. But if you actually read what Mao wrote, he doesn't talk about any of these things, which is always a bit of a problem when you talk to people. And hopefully I have a very long delayed article that I wrote on that, but it's taking a while because, we're in a university and you have to do administrative tasks and teach students. So, however, once that connection has been made, this becomes accepted in all aspects. And now some of you might raise the issue that, on one level, I mean, we're academics, so that's fine. We can talk about finally parsing intellectual issues for their own sake. This is actually quite an important issue in real terms right now. Because when you go talk to American military personnel, they are very they're thinking that the Chinese must be doing this indirect warfare, that that's what they're thinking. This is worse in political science because they're even less good at this. But we actually have an issue right now in practical terms where the way we're substituting Swinza and the particular interpretation for actual knowledge is badly influencing the way we conceive of what could happen in a battle or in a war with China or possible conflict. So we have these people who are saying, well, China's going to fight this way because they do indirect strategy, because Mao, because Swinza. And when you say, well, that's actually not how they're thinking of it, and have you actually read their current thinking on these things? Well, they don't read that because they don't. And then you just have this substitution of a particular reading and a particular construction of how things are supposed to go. There's a lot of very unhappy people when I give these talks in the US military because you sort of open up the question like, how about you actually learn what they're thinking rather than read this one book that you've misunderstood anyway? So here's the issue that I run into at the same time, which is I kept looking for indirect strategy now. And at least in open source, I don't have a security clearance. I'm not reading anything secret. I don't know anything that's not available publicly. This notion of indirect strategy does not appear in modern Chinese military discussions or government discussions. They have other ideas, which also we don't talk about. But there is no term. You don't see this like indirect strategy coming up again and again. There was that craze for a while on the Thucydides trap, which was that strange idea that Graham, what's his name, came up with about comparing the rise of China to the rise of Athens versus Sparta. And that was very popular in Chinese text for a while. And you have all these Chinese writers talking about the Thucydides trap, and some of them realizing, you sort of read the stuff in Chinese and they're kind of getting far into it, and they suddenly say, wow, this is not a good explanation of what's going on. But so now why do we in the West see these things this way, and what's the significance of that? So let me turn now to the issue with Clausewitz. So first of all, we have this problem where a Chinese text, Sunzi's Art of War, Sunzi Bing Fa, is um, detached from the Chinese context and then recontextualized in the West. And it just, uh, of course, you end up doing that because you take the text out of context and you try to fit it into your thinking. Very strangely with Swinza, it actually ends up being very much physically part or intellectually part of the West. So this is really the core of it in the 20th century, which is that Little Hart is involved in Griffith's 1963 translation. Uh, and so the reason why we get this paradigm is that Little Hart is opposing Clausewitz. So Little Hart's opposition to Clausewitz ends up being Swinza's opposition to Clausewitz, and Little Hart's attachment of indirect strategy then creates in Clausewitz must be direct strategy. And of course, I'm speaking to a mostly German audience, and you'll be not surprised to think that that the English look at the Germans and say, well, this is the Germans, they're very direct, and there is no subtlety in being German. So this makes a lot of sense to a British audience, to an American audience, positively or negatively. And then this gets attached to these notions of World War I trench warfare. So why did you get this trench warfare? It was because they were following Clausewitz, and Clausewitz being German was direct, and he went straight at the French, and we had this crashing in, and this is what happens, and this is Western strategy, because Western strategy is stupid that way. Because the West and this gets into a much larger characterization or mischaracterization of West versus East, which is Europeans, Westerners are direct, and Chinese people, Easterners are clever and indirect, and they are not direct. And by the way, this gets even worse because if you travel in some of the circles I'm in, you have this kind of construction that China ends up actually standing in not just for the Swinzen doesn't just end up standing in for Chinese strategy, it ends up standing in for all non-Westerners. So everybody you don't understand is indirect, as opposed to Westerners who are direct. And some of that, of course, comes out of the notion that I understand a Westerner, I don't understand a foreigner. So when a foreigner says something and I don't really understand what they mean, I think they're being indirect. They're not speaking clearly or directly. But it's this interesting aspect there. So Little Hart has made Clausewitz a straw man. He talks about him as the Mahdi of mass, and that the biggest problem was Clausewitz. Now, Little Hart does that because Little Hart, if you read Little Hart, you realize that he has a very interesting intellectual position. He's not an academic, so he makes his living by writing, which means he actually has to make his books popular enough to sell. He's also writing a column for the Times, the military Times. So he has to take large concepts, simplify them, make them dramatic, make them saleable. At the same time, he's trying to balance that off between attempting to show that he does understand things. So he'll do these weird things where he'll say, Clausewitz is very simple. He's just this way. And then he'll sort of say, well, but actually he doesn't say that. So he's both caught between trying to show that he deeply understands Clausewitz and he's read him. By the way, the translations that were available at that time weren't that great. A lot of the nuance in German is lost. The Peter Paré, Michael Howard translation is not available uh, to Little Heart, although there are arguments over the Peter Paré Little Michael Howard translation and issues there. So we have this kind of balancing out here. But Little Heart needs Clausewitz. He makes Clausewitz the bad guy. So once he's got this bad guy, Clausewitz, he simplifies him down to direct, and then he says, I'm proposing this new thing, this indirect approach to strategy, which is going to nullify this direct approach. So what becomes very interesting here is Little Heart's trying to make a name for himself by this, and Clausewitz, by the way, wasn't actually very popularly known or well regarded in the English-speaking world at that time. A lot of his importance will actually come out of both Little Heart's attacks on him and nuclear strategy after World War II. So when Little Heart is brought in to write this forward to the Swinza translation, by the way, he's actually asked to write a forward to another Swinza translation at about the same time, which he turns down. And he is asked to write forewords to a whole bunch of other books, and he actually doesn't do it. He's very careful about that. Littlehart asserts that this strategy of Swinza's is indirect, so now he says, well, look, Swinza 2,500 years ago came up with this strategy, which is the same as mine. Therefore, it must be good because it's lasted 2,500 years and the Chinese are wonderful. That by itself is an odd enough comment to make because, it wasn't like everyone was thinking in the early 20th century that China was such a wonderful place. For good reason, China was in terrible state. But this notion of essentially what we joke about now, Oriental wisdom, that Swinza being an ancient text must therefore be wonderful and powerful and great because it's an ancient text and it's not Western, so it has some kind of profound strategy. It's something that we don't understand. This also, by the way, connects to a much larger myth that also persists that somehow the Chinese were not military or not martial, which of course is back to the same thing. If you don't know about the 2,500 years of wars and huge battles, suddenly you think, wow, the Chinese are great. They're not military. Well, why did we think that? Back to the same problem in the 20th century. In the 20th century, particularly the early part of the 20th century, people were saying, wow, the Chinese, they really were pushovers when the West showed up. And by the 19th century, they were really weak militarily. So why were they weak militarily? Well, then the Chinese argument is, well, we're not really a martial people. And you'll get this utter nonsense about how all these dynasties were formed like without fighting. And I always imagine that I should do a body count about how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the battles to form the Sung dynasty. And I'm sure Barron could do it for all of the Ming. And there are these huge battles taking place. And yet somehow the people buy this notion that the Chinese are not military. They're not martial. And by the way, this strays over into concepts of martial arts. And we see this played out today. And you'll get these very strange conceptions about how you have this culture it was not martial. Oh, and they didn't use laws either. And there's, of course, this entire tradition of Chinese law that was simply unknown. So they were like, oh, the Chinese don't run their empires that way. They're just totally different. And now, of course, now what we're finding out is we start understanding things better. There were wars. There was a lot of wars. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of fighting. And there was an entire legal tradition. So this is all part of that somehow the Chinese weren't like that. Now, if you like the Chinese, this was a good thing, right? They were indirect. They're not so stupid as to go directly at people, unlike us in the West. And if you're stupid, or so, if you're going to fight like an idiot, yeah, you fight directly. This, by the way, will ramify into such studies like Victor Davis Hanson's The Western Way of Warfare, where he flips that and he says, No, no, no. The reason why the West has always been so successful, why is the West wonderful, or how the West won, comes down to because the West is direct. Now, of course, Hansen, being a classicist, talks about the ancient Greeks, and then he says, well, and the ancient Greeks were like this, and then 2,000 years later, 2,500 years later, and that's why the Europe West is so powerful now. And you say, well, that's really odd because A, the Greeks didn't just fight that way, and B, that was not how war was fought in the West over, 2 millennia. But somehow these simplistic notions become really important. And again, why they're important now is because we have political leadership who imagines that that's the case and these very simplistic ideas. And it all comes back to this misunderstanding of Swinza. So, where this becomes even more pernicious is after World War II, uh, we have this very strong association of Clausewitz comes back into fashion as people grapple with all of the new modes of warfare that came out of World War II, most particularly strategy itself and nuclear warfare with that. Because if you look at the way people were thinking about things before the development of the strategic bomber, we have the bombing of Germany. We have even more significantly, from the perspective of the development of these strategic ideas, the bombing of Japan and the nuclear bombing. The United States develops this B-29, which actually costs more to develop than the atom bomb. And by the time they've actually worked all the kinks out of it, they don't need it anymore. But because it's this incredibly expensive weapon system and very, very sophisticated, they start building a strategic thought around these strategic bombers, and you have nuclear bombs. So now we have this concept of strategic bombing, which has to be wrapped in a sort of intellectual process. That's not a bad thing. You should actually figure this out. But now Clausewitz becomes very closely tied to strategic culture and the West, and all of this gets tied together. So let me turn to Swinza in and out of context. One of the oddest things I found while doing the book is that, in fact, Father Amio's translation actually contributes directly to the reconstitution and the shift in understanding of what the modern term strategy means. The French stratégique to stratégie, and I will not try to pronounce the French correctly here, but this is a very big shift that comes out very directly by Mazaroy, who changes this notion of what strategy means from the art of being a general, which was the original Greek understanding of it, to what we would understand now as a broader concept that goes beyond the military. That's really what Mazaroy's shift is. 1771, 70, I think 70, 78. And he has quotes that show that he had read the French translation of Swinza. So Swinza actually, in a bizarre move, directly contributes to the modern conception in the West of what the term strategy comes to mean, which is weird. Even more so, Mezeroy is an Enlightenment thinker. So Swinza gets brought in by Enlightenment thinkers. His thinking, as interpreted by Father Amio, as understood by these men, becomes part of Enlightenment thinking about war. And of course, we have Clausewitz, who is the counter-Enlightenment or German Romantic uh, thinker against that. And then Little Hart, unconsciously, he doesn't seem to have understood this connection, recapitulates that. So Little Hart then turns it and says Clausewitz is wrong. And basically, Little Hart, in a certain sense, is returning to an Enlightenment concept of warfare, which, of course, has been influenced by Swinza, who was made into an Enlightenment thinker. So now, at the same time, we have Western concepts of strategy which have gone to China, uh, both in terms of if you read people like uh, Zhu De, the Chinese general who was in charge of the Chinese military thing with Mao, and Mao himself, they read Clausewitz. So they were reading Western thinkers. They actually understood, they had much better educations in Western military thought than they had in Chinese military thought. So they understood things in Western terms, But when you turn it around, we now have Chinese political scientists in particular who go to the West, come to America, come to Europe too, presumably. They go into political science departments and they learn Western political science. Then they go back to China and they write these weird articles in Chinese where they're interpreting China. But in fact, when you read what their all their reference points are Western political science. And most of them read classical Chinese very poorly. And so you get these Chinese political scientists trained in the West who then misread classical Chinese texts. There's a whole wonderful set of things where they badly misread the Yantie Lun, the discourses on salt and iron, looking for essentially Western strategic conceptions. Well, when you have, as we all know about political science, tends to do this, a very specific theoretical model that you're trying to prove, you go to another culture and you find out that it proves your model. The information doesn't change your model changes the information. You fit that into that. So we have this concept in China when they write about these things, which looks very Western. Now, even in China and in the West, you'll have this discussion of Sunzi uh, as a Warring States period thinker. And of course, the best person writing on this right now is John Sullivan, who has done some fabulous work, which hopefully he will actually publish, fingers crossed, on showing how Sunzi's Art of War is not a theoretical text, it's actually a summary of the military experience of the Warring States period. And he shows again and again that a lot of very strange passages in Sunzi, which are hard to understand, are easy to understand when you realize that it's actually not speaking in the abstract, it's speaking with respect to Warring States period military history. So there's situations where he's saying, if you look in Zuochuan, you will find the military example that Sunzi is referring to. And now it makes sense. But what's interesting is what you don't see in the West or in China is, okay, let's say Sunzi grows out of the Warring States period. What about the reinterpretation and interpretation and reinterpretation over and over again across the next 2,000 years? And of course, we know that there are the 11 commentaries, and the 11 commentaries on Sunzi are not, what I want to say, taken very seriously. They're not read as, look, these guys often disagree with each other. So you have interpreters who keep interpreting for all their reasons, and they often are aware of the earlier commentaries. And yet we haven't really studied that because we don't like to think of Sunzi as a text which has different meanings in different times. We also don't like to think about the notion that, for the most part, I would argue, Sunzi is not particularly influential in strategic terms for most of Chinese history. It's classically understood that it's very hard to connect a theoretical military text in any culture with an actual battle or campaign. And that's true in China as well. We don't see extensive debates where guys are quoting Sunzi back and forth at each other. David Graff has an old article, very old article, on an encounter where there is a later discussion of this. This scholar comes in and is quoting Sunzi, and everyone's like, "What an idiot!" And so we have this problem of a text that is important, but doesn't have one meaning that can be discovered. So when we look at Sunzi today, we actually don't know how Sunzi was interpreted at any given time. We would actually have to study that. So the reason why I say may or may not be understood as he was in the past is because we simply don't have this extensive discussion of how Sunzi's interpretation changed over time, how it was different, how it differed. This would require an enormous amount of scholarship, which I hope we will get to. But at the moment, we don't do that. And of course, people are very uncomfortable with the notion of what happens if Sunzi is understood at different times. Well, then the question would be right now, if Sunzi, and Mark Metcalf is doing wonderful work on showing the influence of Sunzi on current People's Liberation Army thinking, But he's doing it as a scholarly thing. What are they saying? How are they interpreting it right now? Uh, but if Swinza changes in meaning over time, then we actually have to pay attention to what it means at any given time. And we can't just sort of say, well, I read a translation of Swinza, I'm good. I understand this. So I think my last point here is that um, we understand at this point, it is absolutely the case that Swinza is the most important Chinese work. There's no question about that. But if we only understand it in Western terms, in Western works on strategy, then we've got a lot of problems. Because, first of all, of course, we'd have to agree upon what our Western interpretation is. And I would think that actually the German interpretation, let's say, of Clausewitz is very different than the British or the American interpretation of Clausewitz, let alone all those other guys we ignore, like Jomini and Jomini was way more important in the 19th century than Clausewitz. And so when occasionally I teach a class on the American Civil War, they're following Jomini. They've all read Jomini. In fact, some of the generals in the American Civil War met Jomini because he lived to be very old. He was in his 90s. Uh, and to make it even worse, in our interpretations of the American Civil War, Little Hart wrote a book Little Hart wrote on Sherman, I think, and J.F.C. Fuller wrote a book on Grant. And Little Hart puts his mark on Sherman as this master of indirect strategy. And this book sells fantastically. And for a long time in American understandings of the Civil War, we have Little Hart's understanding of the American Civil War where he puts his own ideas about strategy in there. So we have this incredible influence of Western understandings of Xunzi and Western understandings of Chinese military thought that are completely out of context. And this doesn't help us either in the scholarly activity of understanding the past or our current concern, let's say, about how Chinese military, and it's not just the military, their civilian parts, how they understand war at present. So let me stop there. Thank you for your time.